This is my audience. Okay. The wolf had lived in the forest for a very long time. Time and time again, he had lured weary travelers from the path and then proceeded to eat them. Today was no different than any other day. From around the bend in the trail came a young girl wearing a bright red cloak and holding a wicker basket over her arm that smelled like pies and pastries. This girl was named Red for the color of her cloak. She had grown up in the village on the edge of the wood and had heard many stories about the big bad wolf, yet she was not afraid of him. As she walked along the path, the wolf sauntered up to her, asking, "Where are you going today, young girl?" She replied, "Hello, Mr. Wolf. I am going to visit my grandmother who lives in a cottage in the woods, because she's very ill and I'm bringing her pies and pastries to make her feel better." The wolf then asked, "Ooh, how interesting. Where in the woods does she live?" "Oh, she just lives past the flower meadow next to the bubbling creek," Red replied, but she watched the wolf out of the corner of her eyes. Now, the wolf had a very interesting idea, and he bounded off into the undergrowth. His idea was that he would get to the cottage before Red did, eat the grandmother, and then eat Red once she arrived. So he bounded up to the door of the cottage and knocked on it very loudly. Granny opened the door, and before she could even scream, she was gobbled up by the wolf. Now, about half an hour later, Red arrived at the cottage, knocked on the door, and let herself in. Once she entered the cabin, everything was as it should have been. The kitchen was clean, all the dishes were put away, the fire was crackling merrily in the hearth, and Granny was tucked away nice and snug in her bed. However, something seemed very off about Granny, and Red couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. As she got closer, she could see that her grandmother was swaddled in many, many assortments of blankets so that she could barely see her face. "Granny, how are you feeling?" Red asked.
"I'm not feeling very well,"
Granny replied. "Oh, Granny," Red exclaimed. "Your voice, it's so deep and raspy."
"It's because I'm very ill, dear,"
her grandmother replied in the same deep, deep tone. "And your eyes, they're so big," Red said.
"The better to see you with, my dear,"
said the grandmother, flashing her granddaughter a very white, large smile. Red gasped, "Granny, your teeth!" But it was too late. She had realized too quickly or too late that her grandmother was not actually her grandmother, but only the wolf in disguise, and before she knew it, she had been gobbled up. Once inside the wolf's stomach, she found her grandmother there, but they feared that they would never, ever be rescued, and that they would only be slowly digested by the wolf. Now the wolf, feeling very satisfied and very clever, curled up on the floor in front of the fire and quickly fell asleep. Now, while the wolf was sleeping, though, a hunter happened to be passing by the cottage. The hunter was a very close friend of Granny's, and he thought it might be very rude if he did not stop by and at least say hello. However, to his shock and surprise, upon entering the cottage, he found the large wolf fast asleep on the floor, and Granny was nowhere to be seen. After searching through all the rooms, he listened very closely and realized he could hear small voices yelling. As he got closer to the wolf, he realized that the voices were coming from inside the wolf's stomach. He came to the conclusion that the wolf had actually eaten Granny, so he hastily pulled out his knife and sliced open the wolf's stomach. Out tumbled Red and her Granny, looking very shaken but also very determined. "Thank you for saving us," Granny exclaimed. "We thought we were never going to get out." However, Red saw that the wolf was beginning to stir. "Quick, Granny, we have to kill the wolf," she exclaimed. "Grab some stones from outside," the hunter said, and Red did as she was told. The hunter then put 3 large stones inside the wolf's stomach, and Granny quickly sewed up the wolf's stomach. Soon after this, the wolf awoke and was very surprised to see his meal outside of his belly and allied with a knife-wielding hunter. In fear, he fled the cottage, but he did not make it very far because the rocks in his belly were so heavy. He therefore soon collapsed and died. After this occurred, Granny, Red, and the wolf, or not the wolf, the hunter, finished off the items, the cakes and the pastries that Red had brought, and afterwards Red returned home, but she had learned her lesson to not talk to wolves on her way to grandmother's house.